Hey everyone, and welcome to the Evangelist Nick Garrett channel. Today we are looking at the period of time between the First and Second Holy Land Crusades in Western Europe, the early 12th century, which postmodern secular human historians have liked to paint as a period of time when Western Europeans were going on land-hungry imperialist jaunts into the Holy Land. Wait a second. I thought they were ignorant, sick, illiterate, dirty people who lived in grass huts. Well, I say you can't have it both ways and be consistent. We're going to get to the bottom of it today. The idea that 12th century Western Europeans were dirty, ignorant, and starving couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, sources from all over the world confess to the balanced diet of Europeans compared to that of the rest of the world. Many indicated Europeans were twice the size of men and women in other parts of the world. They were just as intellectually complex too, dealing with the same questions that people today dealt with. The Hollywood version of Middle Ages Europe that portrays people during the 12th century living in grass huts and unable to keep dirt from their faces and hands is quite the disservice to people desiring an accurate portrayal of the European world. That, in all honesty, was a time of Renaissance. In fact, some of the great religious orders in all of history were born during the first part of the 12th century. The Knights Templar, and the lesser-known but more popular counterparts, the Hospitaller Knights, had been operating for some time in the Holy Land, taking the vow of religious life but merged with the military dependence and valor of the time in order to lead pilgrims safely to the Holy Land. They would prove an invaluable resource for the incoming Crusader armies. Initially, it had been two knights alone in 1118 AD who set out to form an order to protect the pilgrims en route to the Holy Land. Hugh de Payen, a knight of Burgundy, and Godfrey de Saint-Omer, a knight of southern France. They took the name Poor Knights of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. In 1128 AD, the church officially recognized an order, and with the help of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, the Templars became renowned for their highly effective and vicious form of battle. As their reputation grew, Baldwin I in Jerusalem gave them living space. With high spiritual and temporal discipline, the Knights Templar became known for their combination of special forces-style military capabilities, while their devotion was driven by chivalry and monastic-style vows. When the Crusaders came, the Knights were able to act as guides and strategists. The Hospitaller Knights, on the other hand, had been operating in Muslim-controlled lands for a long time, building hospitals with the permission of the ruling emirs. They also built homes for the sick and helped in any way they could to aid Christians subjugated in Muslim lands. Most importantly, they knew the region, the players, the pace of life, and were hardened from years spent in the Levant. Life in that part of the world was just complicated for Christians, Jews, and Muslims. All three groups retaliated against each other with brutal reprisals at times. There were pockets of peace and pockets of violence in all parts of the region. To complicate matters, the Mongols were pushing west from Asia, which caused the migration of mostly Islamic groups into the growing powder keg of the Levant. Still, with all those challenges facing them, somehow Europe found her identity in this call to crusade, and it brought them to an age of enlightenment on the heels of Urban's Crusader spirit. Even Jewish sources, which have in modern times been highly critical of the Christian West during the Middle Ages, admit, quote, "There were barbaric centuries in which civilization moved slowly and very painfully, though there were magnificent creations to light the darkness, particularly during the 12th century Renaissance," end quote. Because of the Christian influence on people's thinking, coupled with new trade relations opening on the southern borders of Europe from the now well-established Crusader states, the quality of life for the average person as well as the noble improved. During the first several decades of the 12th century, the nation-state system of borders, national identity, economies, and social constructs grew. The Pope Calixtus II, for example, had been able to bring settlement to the investiture controversy that had split the papacy in the time of Gregory VII. Whether or not he was the ideal pope to preside over such a compromise, having benefited from simony himself, some states had actually begun to edge out the influence of the Roman Catholic Church for precisely this reason. A first Lateran Council was called in 1123 AD with the purpose of clarifying guidelines and hoping to correct the behavior of clergy, as well as clarifying appropriate crusade behavior. Other initiatives included the removal and election of bishops and abbots from secular backgrounds as resolution and compromise to the investiture controversy. One of the consequences of the Crusades had been a linking of the church with various monarchies in a partnership that, no matter how noble it was initially, resulted in additional states whose long-term interests were more civil and governmental than spiritual. This dynamic both damaged the church's reputation, perhaps in part unfairly, and caused the view that the papacy was nothing more than another monarch of a nation-state type entity playing politics with others. Even after the recent controversy, the church struggled to remove itself completely from temporal affairs and return to a strictly spiritual authority over the people, if it ever was that. For example, much of her infrastructure was centered on administration of the tithe. It always aimed to ensure her financial health at great expense to many, just like a monarch collecting taxes. Interestingly, it had been the first crusade preached by Pope Urban II that had effectively formed this codependent relationship with secular kingdoms in Europe for the purpose of warring in the Holy Land. Pope Urban had risen above the controversy, and perhaps one considers that over the decades after the First Crusade, compromise to solve the fissure between the church and the nation-states brought the church back into the geopolitical sphere in general. Political life was changing too. People gained more stability and autonomy, increasing intellect, quality of life, and higher, lowest moral common denominators in the West. The church, therefore, looked to create a slightly new identity that rose above the growing cynicism about her role, even while trying to maintain crucial relationships with European monarchs. The church tried to reframe how she was viewed among the body of believers. While some of the issues of the First Lateran Council continued well on into the future, it served as a statement of intent to address the challenges the church saw in itself. The council also served as the reaffirmation of some of Pope Gregory VII's reforms from years earlier, such as celibacy for clergy. The council was well attended, but results mixed. 22 canons were affirmed in the council, but afterwards the behavior addressed by the canons seemed to continue without abatement. It is possible that by the time the Second Lateran Council was called, about 16 years later in 1139 AD, the intent was to give Pope Innocent II the public venue to re-exert his authority now that his rival, an antipope named Anacletus, was dead. Anacletus had also been elected pope the same day as Innocent, based on a split in the new canon law, stating election by the College of Cardinals. One had the support of a faction tied to the temporal powers, and the other did not. Innocent II was sent into exile in the Alps. Far from laying low, however, he had the support of key figures such as Bernard of Clairvaux and Peter the Venerable. So much for the First Lateran Council bringing resolution and returning to Gregory VII's reforms. When Anacletus died in 1138 AD, it left Pope Innocent II alone to rule, which had the effect of reducing tensions greatly, as all eyes went to one leader for the administration of the church. This was a timely resolution considering the virtual state of war by crusaders in the Holy Land. The Crusades could not be packaged into one neat set of definable years. Crusaders also didn't simply take back cities and then go home. To be sure, some did, but there were Europeans and entire forces that migrated permanently to these new homes in Outremer, which at times could be volatile. The Crusades themselves continued every day for hundreds of years with battles to take cities, push back Muslims, defend against their attacks, make treaties, and try to establish permanent peacetime life in these Crusader states. At the same time, near constant infighting between Arabs and Turks, as well as the growing push of Mongols westward, added to an already complicated situation. Each new generation went to crusade based on the stories and legends that came out of the first. Names like Godfrey of Bouillon became synonymous with the chivalry of the Crusader spirit, while later names like Renaud de Chatillon, whether fairly or unfairly, became synonymous with brutality and excesses of power. Meanwhile, the Crusader spirit had continued to spread. It was a spirit that would soon be tested in a new generation, as events in the Holy Land shifted the balance of power yet again. The Crusades still gave a chance for people of lesser nobility to rise to the status of titles for chivalrous and brave action. Baldwin, for example, who had taken Edessa in the First Crusade, may have always been in the shadow of his two older brothers, particularly Godfrey, had it not been for the chance to shine, rise to the position of Count in Edessa, and eventually the first king of the new Christian Jerusalem. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to talking to you next time when we learn about Emir Zengi taking back Edessa and the Second Crusade starting by the papal bull Quantum Predecessoris. Talk to you next time.